This video is kind of to talk about some problem solving with squeaks or sounds that we're just not really happy with. Anything where we feel as though the clarinet isn't working like we think it's supposed to. Um, I feel all instruments can be a little frustrating. I think clarinet is frustrating in particular because when we're trying to figure out why it's making the noises we don't like, it can feel like there's a lot of different possible reasons why. So I just wanted to kind of cover some really, really basic things to double check and make sure that they aren't the source of the problem, basically. And you can pretty much break those possible solutions into three categories. One is fingers, two is embouchure, so which is kind of a big category for just everything with our mouth. Our embouchure is our muscles in our mouth are set up here. And then the third category is actual equipment, like the reed itself. And I put that last because I think it can be sometimes a little too easy to just blame things on the reed when there may be some other things that we can try before we go that direction. So the first possible solution, fingers. The clarinet is an open hold instrument, so for the notes to actually kind of come out correctly, it's important that the holes are completely sealed, that we don't have any leaks, right? Any of our fingers kind of leaking outward. If we have some of those leaks, the sounds can kind of vary. Sometimes we might feel like the note is there, if we're leaking a little bit, it might feel like the note is there, but it's faint or it's not coming out as easily as it should. But then when we kind of get our fingers in position, all of a sudden it sounds full again. Sometimes there's just no sound that comes out at all, and sometimes we get a squeak, right? It could be any of these, but every once in a while, if we have a finger leak, we get a squeak instead of the note that we want. So the first thing to check is make sure that we're not kind of getting almost like a claw kind of feeling with our fingers. We might think that we're supposed to use our fingertips to cover the holes. It kind of makes sense. But what I like to think of it as is more finger pads, not fingertips. By finger pads, I just mean trying to get the fatter part of our fingers. So we really actually leak over the rings a little bit more than we might realize. So that would be the first thing to check. Make sure we don't kind of have that claw look. We want finger pads, not fingertips. That also allows us to be a little more relaxed. With fingertips, it's very tight and we kind of have to clench. So if we let these leak over a little bit, we don't have to press as hard for the notes to do what we kind of want them to do. Best way to check that is a mirror or maybe a phone with a camera facing front. Just something so that we can check ourselves. It might feel like everything is covered. It might feel like we have it in exactly the right place, but our fingers kind of have funny ways of moving around when we don't realize it, and it can be actually hard to tell when there's really a leak happening. So that would be something to check. Finger pads, not fingertips. So the second possible section of solutions, the embouchure, is a bigger section. And there are probably going to be suggestions and things that I won't cover here, but I'm going to try to just talk about a few things to think about in terms of embouchure. The first, I think, is probably the place that we go immediately is squeezing. It's frustrating when it's squeaking or when the notes aren't coming out. We want to force them to come out, and so we might squeeze really hard with our mouth, with our embouchure. And in those cases, not only do we sometimes get squeaks, but again, it might feel like the reed just shuts off. Just now nothing is coming out. So we really want to make sure that we are relaxed but still firm. I think it's better to be thinking about our mouth as firm on the clarinet rather than tight. I also recommend that we think more about the tightness coming from the corners of our mouth instead of the biting from top to bottom. But I would say experiment. So if you're having a bad, squeak day, or the notes just don't seem to be working the way they're supposed to, experiment with relaxing, loosening up a little bit more. And then sometimes if we're too relaxed, we'll get some other problems of our own. So experiment with possibly thinking firmer as well. But again, I think focusing on really making sure that the corners are firm is a better approach than thinking about biting. Your bottom lip will thank you later also if we're not necessarily biting too hard. Talking about the bottom lip actually kind of goes to the next part of the embouchure that we should think about if we're getting a lot of squeaks and the notes sound not like we want them to. The bottom lip, we learn, is supposed to roll over our teeth. How far? That's really the question. So if we don't roll it far enough, if we get kind of something like this, not only do we possibly have squeaks that can happen, but the sound is also shaky. And we also start to get kind of that gravelly-ness as well. If we roll too far, if we're all the way back there, in addition, again, to the squeaks, it also becomes really difficult to keep the seal, to keep these corners from letting air escape. You might feel like we get a lot more tired because this is so far back that we're having to kind of work really hard to close the corners. And then again, that could start to really cause some pain with our bottom lip. So the answer, I won't get too specific, but it should be somewhere in between. We do want some of the what we call the fleshy part of our lip to be in contact with the reed. We don't want it necessarily to be just the bare skin down here, but we don't want it to be kind of the really flabby part of our lip either. Something like this. The last part about embouchure work that might make a difference also is bite depth. Bite depth is what it basically is how much mouthpiece do we have inside our mouth, and then in the same way, how far down or back is our top teeth and our bottom lip. Too far down, and even if it's not squeaky, there's almost an edge to the sound. It almost feels like it's always just kind of on the edge of cracking or squeaking. Too far back, we get that same issue of the reed kind of shutting off or closing off, and then also some potential for squeaks as well. So this is another place where I'm just going to say that the answer is really somewhere in between, and you should experiment with a little bit more, experiment with a little bit less, and really kind of see what happens. I think as we get older and play more clarinet, it can become more specific. There's a very specific place to go. But for now, I think starting out, it's important to just kind of try to find what works, and then try to remember that, try to stick with that. Kind of in the same way that I'm talking about kind of the tightness and the lip roll, but mostly the tightness. Just finding what works right now, making sure that it's not too loose, not too tight. So same thing with our bite depth. Not too far down, not necessarily too far back. What the bite depth really does is it changes where our bottom lip in particular is on the reed. Is it on a thick part? Is it on a thin part? Where exactly is it? Another thing that's kind of related, but I kind of saved it for last because we want to think about these other things first. The angle at which we're playing, because that can actually affect almost the same thing. What is actually touching the reed? If we're kind of at a completely horizontal angle, our lip is looking kind of more like this, right? If we're at a straight on angle, then all of a sudden our lip is kind of like this. So that also can affect what kind of a day we're having with reeds and with notes. If it's straight up and down, it feels a little pinched off, and rightly so. We're kind of cutting the reed off, and then also we're pushing up against our top teeth, which we don't want to do. If we're too far this way, we get kind of some of the same graveliness, shakiness, and it's hard to really get the right lip roll. So, one more time, not too far, not too far, somewhere in the middle. What we might sometimes refer to as a 45-degree angle, but I just like to think of it as, somewhere between this and this, if that kind of makes sense. So now we've tried all of those things, and it's still just really, really frustrating. Now we can start to kind of look at our reed. I'll start by kind of talking again about where is our lip kind of touching the reed, because another way to work with that is, well, how high or low is the reed? Now, the reed that I'm actually playing on right now has a little bit of a chip in it. I don't know if we can see that in the video. But it still plays relatively well, so I'm going to use it anyway. And right now, I have it set to what we usually recommend, which is just below the tip of the mouthpiece. So there's a little bit of mouthpiece showing. If I go too high, like if I'm up to like around here, where we actually see the reed peaking above the tip of the mouthpiece, that can lead to some of its own problems. And I usually end up having to work a little bit harder than I want to. I can feel like I'm just pushing. So by the same amount, if I lower it, so now I'm got some mouthpiece showing, but well, maybe even a little bit lower. So I've got some mouthpiece showing, but more than we probably want to. I'm like really pushing and it doesn't want to come out at all. If I try to really make it happen, I'm definitely going to start to get some squeaks. So let's try somewhere in between. Much better. So this is where I kind of ended up. Now, we can experiment with that as well. Even small changes, not just the extreme ones that I was showing before. Even small changes could possibly make it easier or harder to play. But again, the reason that I saved the reed section for last is that we want to try some of the other possible explanations first. Check our fingers, finger pads, not fingertips. Experiment with the firmness on the corners. Check our lip roll. Check our bite depth. Experiment with that. Further down, further back. So try all sorts of things to see if we can start to kind of problem solve and work on those squeaks by ourselves. The last thing that I'll say is that even with all of these possible solutions, squeaks do happen. And they happen to everybody, and it's kind of part of the learning process. I mean, these are muscles, our fingers, our mouth, our embouchure. We have to develop these muscles, and we have to figure out where the notes live in the clarinet, as I put it. We just have to kind of find find out where they live, figure out what works and what doesn't. And part of that process is the what doesn't work. So don't get too frustrated if you have a bad read day or a bad note day, because it happens to everybody. The important thing is to just keep trying to find out why, and then solve those problems so that over time they get better. The most important thing is just not to stop and keep practicing.